All right. Good morning. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today in Tacoma with you all. I'd like to present my talk, a recipe for Indigenous research in geography, and some other things too, because a lot of the things that I'll talk about today will be applicable to. Ooh, everything all right there? Good, awesome. Will be applicable to many different things that you do in academia as far as research. And so it's good to see a full room. This typically is something that we're used to when we, as Indigenous people, speak to a room. And so I just ask that you listen with an open heart and an open mind. And so a little bit about me. And so my name is, my Ojibwe name is Niiyokamigaabaw, which translates to stand on four earths. I'm a citizen of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe Bullhead Clan. My family comes from Leech Lake. I'm what they call an urban native or an urban Indian. Grew up in Minneapolis due to my grandmother moving her family down there as part of the federal process of relocation in the 1960s. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Victoria, just across the Salish Sea there in Victoria, BC, on Lekwungen-speaking and Wasanich territories. I'm also an affiliate faculty in the Indigenous Nationhood program at UVic, and I'm currently serving a two-year position as a visiting professor in the Department of History at The Ohio State University. So I'm originally from Minneapolis. I hold a number of degrees in geography in affiliate fields. I have a bachelor's degree in geography from St. Cloud State University, which unfortunately has just announced about a month ago that they will be closing their geography department in about 2 years' time, a victim of the neoliberalization of higher education in Minnesota, as we see across North America. I got a master's degree in global Indigenous studies from the University of Minnesota Duluth, which is essentially geography and American Indian studies combined interdisciplinary master's. And then I did my Ph.D. in geography at Ohio State, where I was the first Indigenous Ph.D. graduate in the history of the program. I then went on and did a postdoc in Indigenous environmental history at Ohio State. And then I served my nation as a trustee, the Board of Trustees, the governing board of Leech Lake Tribal College. And so, as mentioned in the introduction, I am the director of the Geographic Indigenous Futures Collaboratory at the University of Victoria, which is my research group. Actually, my colleague here, Dr. Lekezi, is actually another member of the lab as well. And I started this lab in response to the questions that I'm going to ask today, which is how can we do ethical research with Indigenous communities in geography that puts the control of research and the outcomes and benefits of the research back into the hands of Indigenous peoples, given the long colonial history of engagement between geography and Indigenous communities, a colonial engagement which actually continues to the present day, as I'll share some examples here in this talk. We seek to do work differently, and so we follow a set of principles, one of them being that we don't go where we're not invited, and so we do not do work where we are explicitly not invited. As a matter of fact, I would say 99% of the projects that we do, the communities actually approach us. We don't have to go and sell ourselves. We have people come to us, and that at the end of our project that we leave the community with the means to do the work themselves, because at the end of the day, Indigenous people should be in control of their own research, in control of writing their own stories. And so this is the work that our lab does. We have 19 people in our lab now, both graduate and undergraduate students at the University of Victoria, as well as community affiliate members such as Dr. Lekezi and others, ranging all the way from Western Australia to Quebec and everywhere in between. And I love showing off the logo because we commissioned a local Wasanich artist to design our logo based off of our lab mascot, the beaver. Okay, so I want to start off with asking a bit of a rhetorical question, which is, what is data, or what is data? If you were to get a group of scholars together and ask them to define data, would it be a similar answer or similar set of answers to getting a group of geographers in a room together and asking them to define what geography is? Data means a lot of things to people and has a variety of different definitions. Excuse me while I grab my drink here so I don't end up getting a scratchy voice, because that's not fun to listen to. So, when people are usually asked to define data from a basic standpoint, usually the mental image that their definition will conjure up will look something like this: a bunch of numbers or a spreadsheet, something that looked like it was created on a computer, right? Basically quantitative data. But data looks different in Indigenous communities. Well, I would say data looks different if you open up your mind and you take a look at data as being more of a holistic concept. And so when I think of data, I think about much more than just numbers or spreadsheets or shape files. I also think about things such as our language, Ojibwe. That is data as well. There has been a large amount of research that has been done into our language and its structure. It's actually, well, it is similar to many other Indigenous North American languages where it is considered one of the most difficult languages to learn in the world. And so we have had no shortage of researchers coming to our nations to try to unlock the secrets of how to learn Ojibwe. I'm reminded actually of early quote, American explorer who came to our communities and tried to learn the language and could not learn it and then promptly dismissed it and said, well, this language must not be worth learning, right? It must not be civilized, it must not be important because I can't master it. My answer to that would be, well, your data collection methods and your data analysis methods were faulty. The history of our people and our experiences are also data. Oral histories, our written stories, right? Our scrolls, our stories of how we came to be where we're at, how our teachings came to be, and where we're going as a people. That is also data. And again, no shortage of researchers coming to our communities looking to pick the brains of our elders and community members in order to collect data so that they can get their next grant or their next peer-reviewed article. Of a salient nature to, well, this conference today, maps are data as well. I'm actually reminded of my very, very first job talk at an institution that I'll leave nameless, where I presented my dissertation research. And in that job talk, I made very clear that I did not want to share the names of the communities that I worked with, that I did not share the names of the people that participated in my research, and that I was very, very protective and very selective over how I spatialized the information that they were sharing with me. And as usually happens in a job interview, besides the job talk and the teaching demo and the interview and the dinner, that's not really a dinner because you have to be really careful about what you're ordering or if you drink alcohol or what you say to the people that are still making observations about you. The other thing is that you get to go around and you get to talk to faculty, right? And you get to, learn about the departments and they try to sell it to you. And I remember one faculty member in particular saying, I really enjoyed your talk. I thought it was really well done, but I have a bone to pick with you. And of course, me wanting to get this job kind of smiled and was like, okay, well, sure, let's talk about it. And he says, in actual science, you would never be allowed to obscure the sources of your data. And of course, I couldn't say the thing that was actually on my mind at the time, which is like, my friend, have you taken a look at any kind of medical data or health data anywhere in the world, right? But I said, well, I think that's a matter of opinion, right? And that has really driven me to really think through how Indigenous data sovereignty works, particularly in geography, because in my heart, I knew that, well, no, actually, I can obscure my sources of data, and I will obscure my sources of data if the opposite means that they are opened up for extraction and harm to communities. And this has happened time and time and time and time again in Indigenous communities. As a matter of fact, nowadays, one of the quickest ways to get people's backs up against the wall and to get their hackles up if you go into an Indigenous community is to stride in and say, well, I am here to do research. Many communities do not like that word. As a matter of fact, it has come to the point where research in Indigenous communities has come to represent a four-letter word of sorts. Now, this does not mean that Indigenous communities are anti-scientific. It does not mean that they're anti-research. It means that there are serious concerns that have been raised about the way that research has been done in Indigenous communities by dominant academia since the advent of dominant academia's engagement with Indigenous peoples. Let me start out by giving you a few examples of how this came to be. And in doing so, we need to really start by talking through what I define as the colonial logics of research. And so modern, quote, research really comes out of, I feel, the Enlightenment, the move of European society out of the so-called Dark Ages into a new era of discovery, of intellectual enlightenment, and a reclamation of the aspects of, quote, European civilization that were viewed as endowing it with power and prestige. And of course, I use quotes around European because Europe itself really didn't conceive of itself as European really until its encounter with the other, right? With the global South, with Africa, with Indigenous Americans across North and South America. But this logic of research began to make the argument that European Western traditions of knowledge and knowledge production is objective, right? That the people that are empowered, that are qualified to create knowledge, do so with the ability to make absolute judgments of what they see around them, right? So that the empirical analysis that they do should be taken as gospel. It is driven out of the desire to know all that can be known, and if there are any obstacles or any impediments to generating that knowledge, that those obstacles are to be broken down by any means necessary. This is at the heart of so much scientific, anthropological, and geographical and other sorts of research and knowledge that have been generated through colonization, through hegemonical research and power dynamics, and the ways that we as Indigenous people have been researched on by dominant academia for centuries at this point. Let me give you a few modern-day examples. For people that are familiar with Indigenous research methodologies and data sovereignty, these will come as no surprise to you because these are some of the most fundamental missteps that we have seen in Western academia, which is quite astonishing considering the sheer amount of missteps that these are considered the most egregious. One example, the unfortunate case of Arizona State University and the Ovasapai Nation. And so in the 1990s, during this turn in genomic research and science, where genomic research was beginning to become more mainstream, where people were working to unlock the human genome and were working to be able to tell the story of where humanity came from, a group of researchers from Arizona State University went to the Ovasapai Nation, and they came with a project proposal. They said, we want to take blood samples from your tribal members because we know based on health data that there are high incidences of diabetes within your community. We want to study the DNA, the genetic material in your blood samples to see if there are genetic markers that are more prevalent in your people for diabetes, both type 1 and type 2. Now, speaking as an Ojibwe person with type 2 diabetes, speaking as coming from an Indigenous community, diabetes is one of the scourges of many Native communities across the United States and Canada. And so the Ovasapai Nation said, yes, this research has the potential to benefit us, right? It can possibly lead us to do early intervention with people so that they don't develop diabetes and they don't have to go on dialysis or have kidney failure or have limbs amputated or many of the other comorbidities that come with diabetes. And so the researchers came, they took the blood samples and they brought them back to Tempe to begin doing research. Now, the Ovasapai Nation sat and eagerly awaited the results. Now, more and more time went by, and the Ovasapai Nation said, well, what's going on? What are the results of the research? And they began doing some digging, and they realized that the researchers at Arizona State University had actually gone far beyond what the tribe had consented to. They were analyzing the blood samples for markers for other health issues such as dementia and Alzheimer's. They were making copies of the genetic material and sharing it with other researchers at Arizona State University who are not on the research team. And the Ovasapai Nation began to learn that those samples were beginning to be shared outside of the university altogether. And so the tribe came to the researchers and they said, when we consented to the research, we consented for a very specific purpose. And now you're doing all sorts of things with our blood samples that we didn't consent to, and you are sharing those blood samples with people that we don't know, and we don't know what they're doing with it. And so the tribe filed a lawsuit against the university to get the samples back. They eventually got the samples back and disposed of them in a culturally appropriate manner. And they went to Arizona State University and they said, listen, we trusted you, you came to us under false pretenses, and we trusted you anyways, and you've caused tremendous harm to our community. Since we clearly cannot trust you to come into our community and behave in a respectful manner, now you are not allowed to come to our community at all. And so for a period of just over 20 years, no Arizona State University faculty or graduate student was allowed to conduct research on the Ovasapai Nation. I know this because a good friend of mine, Crystal Sosi, who is an Indigenous geneticist, a Dene tribal member, was the first researcher who was allowed back by the Ovasapai Nation just fairly recently, 2 years ago. It took an Indigenous geneticist for the tribe to feel comfortable doing research again with the university. Let me give you another example that's a little bit closer to geography here. One of the things that I often teach about in my Indigenous geographies class at the University of Victoria is the unfortunate saga of the Mexico Indigena project. And so in the 1990s and the 2000s, geography was going through one of its frequent existential crises that we deal with about every 15 to 20 years about where the discipline is going. And the American Geographical Society, not the AAG, but the other geography organization in the United States, was also going through another crisis of its own. At the turn of the 20th century, the AGS was the foremost geographical organization in the world, or at least the United States, which, depending on your view of American exceptionalism, some people could probably say, well, that's the world, but folks at the RGS and other organizations might agree to disagree with that. But the American Geographical Society said, we are losing membership to the AAG. People aren't coming to our conferences anymore. They're not engaging with us. What do we do? And somebody said, well, what we need to do is we need to carve out a niche for ourselves in re-embracing the proud geographic tradition of field work, where geographers go into communities, go into places and write down their observations and collect data about what they see, and then they come back and they share it. And so the American Geographical Society developed a program called the Bowman Expeditions, which was going to be this grand, triumphant series of projects where they would pay researchers to go and do field work with communities. Now, the first group that reached out to them and took up funding through the Bowman Expeditions were a group of geographers, including a couple of fellows named Peter Herlihy and Jerome Dobson from the University of Kansas. They had been doing work with Indigenous peoples in Oaxaca and in Nicaragua and Belize and other places in Central America for decades at that point. And so they said, we have the experience of working with Indigenous communities. We have a proven project. We have this new project now where Indigenous Oaxacans want us to come in and be able to help them map out their territory so that they can press for land claims with the Mexican government. And so the American Geographical Society couldn't give them funding quick enough, right? So they were like, yes, this is the first Bowman expedition. We can't wait to see the work that you do. And we look forward to hearing what happened. And so Herlihy and Dobson went down to Oaxaca and they began doing community participatory mapping with the Indigenous communities. Now, what the community did not know is that Herlihy and Dobson did not just have AGS funding. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to Lawrence, Kansas, where the University of Kansas is located, but not too far away from that is Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where the U.S. Foreign Military Studies Office is located, which is a military U.S. Army office or department which is devoted to essentially collecting human intelligence on peoples around the world. One of the most famous architects of American occupation policy in Iraq, David Petraeus, was a part of the FMSO, for example. And the US military approached Dobson and Herlihy and said, hey, you're going down there and collecting data down there in Mexico? Here, we'll give you some money too. The only thing that you have to do is you just have to send the mapping data back up to us, right? And we're just using it to create maps. No big deal. And so Herlihy and Dobson and their graduate students, behind the backs of the Indigenous communities they were working with, transmitted data back up to Kansas to the United States military, which then turned around and used them to create counterinsurgency maps that were designed to be shared with the Mexican government in order to try to curtail any Indigenous protest activities there in Oaxaca. The Indigenous community was extremely upset when they found this out, and they asked for the maps back. It also led to probably the closest thing we've had to a civil war within the discipline of geography. As a matter of fact, we are still feeling the aftershocks of that debate to this present day. I'll give you another example here. I do work, my own work is around Indigenous cultural responses to climate change, but that was born out of long-term work around settler disturbances of burial sites in Minnesota and the ways that Indigenous communities have used tribal historic preservation processes to protect these spaces. And so even the act of repatriation and the act of, our deceased ancestors is at the heart of data sovereignty. And so the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 was passed as a response to longstanding processes of grave robbing, of the holding of Indigenous artifacts and cultural objects in museums and institutions. And under the tenets of the law, institutions are to identify these objects and they are to interface with local communities and they are to repatriate them. Now, this has been a long-term project. NAGPRO was passed 34 years ago, and I would say that we probably are maybe not even a quarter of the way through proper repatriation, and universities and institutions throw up all kinds of excuses, right? Like, we need to do research, or we don't know what community this came from, and so we can't interface with the community. Some researchers have gone as far as to say that, well, Indigenous communities demanding repatriation are being anti-scientific. They are trying to get in the way of us doing good work for humanity, and that there should be no such thing as repatriation or Indigenous data sovereignty. The book on the left-hand side is called Repatriation and Erasing the Past. I would not recommend reading that book because it is a pseudo-scientific, racist piece of drivel. But of course, I must have some kind of gluttony for punishment, and so I wrote a review about it, right? And I read the book. And in the book, they said, well, these native people believe in talking crows and worlds built on the back of turtles. They're not scientific, right? And we are the Ph.Ds. We are the ones that are empowered with the ability to generate knowledge and to make objective determinations about knowledge and data, and that we are here to help the world. Does this sound familiar from a few slides ago? And so I wrote a review about this in Transmotion. If you chat afterwards and you're interested in getting and seeing it, I can get email addresses and I can send it to you. I essentially did a review paper as a book article or as a book review article. And interestingly enough, Elizabeth Weiss, who is down at San Jose State University as an anthropologist, seems to steer clear away from me. I think it's one of those things where racist researchers generally don't like it when the native is able to match wits with them. Okay, so I've talked a lot about harm here. I want to pivot now to the main part of my talk, which is talking about, well, what do we do about this, right? We want to do research, we want to create knowledge, we want to do good work in the world. How can we do this if we want to work with Indigenous communities in a good way that respects those communities and does no harm, right? Do you remember this from the Belmont report, right? Beneficence, avoiding harm. Okay, let me introduce a bit of levity in here. How many of you like to cook? Yep. So I'm on leave this term from UVic, and so I work from home. And so my wife goes out and works, and so I've kind of taken on the household job of being the chef, right? And so I have dinner waiting for her when she gets home. I really like to cook as a little kid, right? You see this little kid here, this cute little toucan and things in that pizza like that. When I used to cook as a kid, I would have all kinds of weird recipes, right? One time I thought that if I put raw oatmeal and some cinnamon and milk and raisins in a bowl, I'd make cereal. It was really bad, right? I also made really good things, like if you take white bread and put Kraft Singles on it and put pepperoni on it, it's actually really, really good if you microwave it up, right? But where am I going with this? When you are cooking something, generally speaking, you follow some sort of recipe, right? Whether it is as simple as you put the ramen in the boiling water and you stir it up and you add the seasoning and it's good, or if you are more culinarily inclined, right, you put the roast in the marinade overnight and then you smoke it and then you cook it and then your family's got a nice, delicious brisket, right? I do love brisket. There are parts to a recipe. So there's the yield, right? There is, well, what is it that you're cooking? You have the ingredient list. What sorts of items do you put into the recipe to make the food? The preparation method, how in the world do you make it? It's very rare that you just throw things together and it becomes an edible item, unless you're in the Midwest with our various salads that we make. Your necessary cooking utensils, they can be as advanced as an immersion blender or a smoker, or they can be your bare hands, right? And then timing. The food unless it is ready to eat, you've got to take either a few minutes or hours in order to cook whatever it is that you want to cook. Are you with me so far here? Or almost, I know we're the thing separating you from lunch, and so maybe I might be making you hungry a little bit here, right? And so when I started to teach about Indigenous research methodologies and started to think about, well, what do we do? Like, how do we go about this? And like, how do I explain this in a way that can be easily disseminated to a wide variety of audiences? And I said, well, let's think about this as a recipe. And so the thing that we'll cook today, and you can imagine a different yield, but this is my PowerPoint slide deck. And so I'm gonna display it up here is, let's imagine cooking a blueberry pie. And at the end of this, I'll actually teach you the Ojibwe word for blueberry pie, which is an extremely long word. All right, so let's get baking. And so here's our yield. Here is our research methodology, a very delicious looking one if I do say so myself. But you need ingredients to put together this pie. And so what is the ingredient list? Well, the first ingredient, 2 parts of a research methodology. And so like any good research project, you will want to construct a research methodology. You very, very rarely can find success going in and being like, well, I'm just going to do whatever and maybe the research will come to me. That generally, it might be kind of fun, but you don't make a lot of forward progress, which are things that like grant organizations and like department chairs and deans like to see, especially if you're trying to get tenure. Or if you're trying to graduate, right, if you're a graduate student, if you say like, oh, I have a concept of a plan to your advisor, they might be like, okay, well, you're gonna have a concept of a thesis or a dissertation and a concept of a degree at that rate. And so you want to construct a strong research methodology, right? So you need your research problem, your research questions, your methods, your broader impacts, your potential products, projects, your location, the peoples or things you wish to analyze. There are a lot of really, really good books out there now on how to construct an Indigenous research methodology, how to think through these sorts of things, right? And so one of the most well-known books, of course, is Linda Tuawai Smith's Decolonizing Methodologies. But now there's a more wide variety of it, right? Even things that are very geographically specific. One of these years, maybe I'll write an Ojibwe research methodology, probably like at the end of my career. Because it'll probably be at that point when I actually maybe know a fraction of something enough to write that book. All right, so there's our first ingredient. The second ingredient, 3 tablespoons of positionality and self-reflexivity, right? Which if you're on the more physical side of the discipline or words, you probably don't come across very often. If you are on the human side, we are beat over the head with these words. Positionality, the way that we view our own role and position in the work that we're doing, right? And so who am I? What is my identity? What guides me to do this work? Self-reflexivity is being the ability to think critically about our own positions and privileges, right? And so when I'm self-reflexive of myself, it's not just I'm a university professor and an Ojibwe tribal member. It's also things like I am funded and I work for a large Canadian public research university. I have access to research funding streams and opportunities that people in community might not ordinarily get. And I carry with me, because I have the 3 fancy letters after my name that apparently denote me as some kind of, quote, expert on Indigenous geographies. I would not call myself an expert by any stretch of the imagination. I am viewed as somebody that is to be respected and listened to whenever I say something, right? And so these are important things, right? Like, who are you? Like, what do you carry with you? What sorts of privileges and structural advantages do you carry with you that the people you are working with may not? You have to ask yourself things like, what sorts of questions do you foresee Indigenous communities having about the work, right? What are some potential benefits? What are some potential harms? What are the ways that your own identity could play into those benefits or harms? And one thing that is really, really important that I don't think we quite ask ourselves enough in research, particularly in geography, and something that I now have myself and my students ask anytime we engage with an Indigenous community, which is, why are you the best person to do this work? Why are you the right person? What do you bring to the community in order to have the right to do that work with them? That's something that we don't ask ourselves enough, right? Like, what, instead of like the community needing to prove themselves as being worthy of a study site, it's like, why are we worthy or deserving as researchers to do that kind of work? Which is a question we don't ask ourselves often enough in academia, right? We just presume that we can just go in and do that work and that our credentials give us the right. But it's much deeper than that. All right. Preparation methods. So now we've put together the pie, and now we're sticking it in the oven. And so the first step is engaging with community oversight processes. And so generally speaking, when you're doing work with an Indigenous community, there is almost always going to be some form of community research oversight. Sometimes they're more traditional in the ways that we recognize, such as institutional review boards or research review boards that are run by Indigenous nations as they are increasingly beginning to develop these. Sometimes it might be the tribal council. You have to go and talk to them and let them know what you're doing. Sometimes it might be a smaller community council. Sometimes it might just be people in the community themselves sitting down with you and asking you, well, what is the work you're doing? Why are you doing this? And why should we work with you? I'm reminded of the one time that a friend of mine from St. Cloud State, who was doing her master's degree, wanted to do research on my reservation, which we don't have an institutional review board. And so she went and talked to me, and she says, well, there's this town on our reservation, there's a town that has a Indigenous slur that starts with an S and ends with a W in the name. And we've tried to change it, and they don't want to change it. And so she had the idea that she says, well, I want to go up there and I want to go door to door and ask people what they think about this. And I'm like, whoa, hold on a second. Does the tribal council or the local Indian council know what you're doing? She's like, well, no, I thought I could just go up there and go door to door. Do I need to ask them? And I'm like, yes, you need to clear this with somebody first, right? First, you're going up asking people about what they think about an anti-Indigenous slur. I'm like, if you are lucky, they'll slam the door in your face. You'll be more unlucky if they start talking to you because they're going to probably give you a piece of their mind for disturbing them and asking them to talk about something that's traumatic to them. I don't think she ended up doing that project because I was like, go talk to the tribal council, and then I didn't hear from her for a while, and so I don't think she did, right? But these sorts of things are the first line of defense for communities, where they want to ask, well, who are you? Why do you want to work with us? Why should we work with you? Even with my own reservation, I went up and I worked with them for a dissertation, and I went around to different community councils and asked them, shared my work. And I remember one time going to one council and sharing it, and then the next morning I was meeting with a member of our tribe who was like the state liaison with our Minnesota Department of Transportation. And the second thing out of his mouth after he says, oh, hi, Deondre, is he's like, yeah, so somebody from the Onegum Council called me last night and they wanted to ask me about, well, who are you and what are you all about? Okay. And I was like, wow, I'm a member of this tribe, and they're asking those sorts of questions as well. They know who I am, but they wanted to know about the work. Consent is an ongoing process is another step, right? Consent, people think, well, if they sign a consent form, that's fine. Consent is not a one-time process. Just because a participant signs a consent form doesn't mean they can't withdraw consent, doesn't mean they can't change the terms of their participation. Make consent as accessible as possible, right? I usually follow the principle that we write our documents at a 5th grade reading level. Why? Not because we think that, well, people on the res can't read at more than a 5th grade reading level, but because we do not want there to be any ambiguity about what it is that they're agreeing to, right? We do not want there to be any question, because in my mind, if there is any ambiguity, if there is not full unequivocal consent, then there is zero consent. We talk about this with sexual violence, right? That the absence of a no does not mean yes. That anything other than a clear, unambiguous, emphatic yes means no. And it's the same thing with research. And it helps too, after you've done consent, check in with folks, right? Periodically check in and be like, how are you feeling about the research? Do you still want to participate? That's something that I was doing in my dissertation project and even afterwards, right? Third step, knowledge, co-production, and support. And so knowledge belongs to communities. Data belongs to communities. Just because they might have their own ideas about how to do the work. As a matter of fact, our lab now, we believe in knowledge co-production with communities exclusively, where we will sit down with the community and we will co-create the research project before it even begins, before we apply for any funding, before we take any actions. We sit down and we actually map out the project, and then we get to work. Allowing community members to take an active role in data collection and other research activities that, especially in places where there is a lot of deeply held knowledge, right? It is good practice to allow the community members to participate directly in the project. It comes down to really kind of the paraphrase here, that it allows Indigenous communities, it allows us to take a part in creating and telling our own stories. Data stewardship and repatriation is really important as well. And so communities will oftentimes ask, they'll say, after you're done with the project, right, after you're done with the interviews, the oral histories, the mapping, Would you mind returning that to us and giving it back to us so that we can use it? Other things that they'll do is they'll say, when you are creating your dissertation, your thesis, your article, your monograph, can you send that to us so we can have a look at it to make sure that our words are being accurately portrayed, right? And so we know what's going on. It's important to recognize and respect that data ultimately belongs to communities in the face of a long history of data being taken out of communities and not shared and returned. So I'm going to do kind of a two-part story here. So let me start out. And I recognize that I'm doing something that they say in the business would be very risky to my career. But as an Indigenous researcher, as the sole Indigenous faculty member in my department, I feel that it is my obligation to call this out, which is that my own department has been aiding and covering up in data theft out of Indigenous communities, out of an Indigenous community for several years now. There was a First Nation that we work with. There was a lab that was collecting animal data out of the waters near that First Nation, and they were not sharing the data with the community. They actually weren't talking to the community at all, but yet they were publishing prolifically about it. They were committing cultural faux pas. They were drinking in a dry community. They were actually damaging, lab members were damaging ecologically sensitive sites. And the First Nation came to my department and said, hey, you need to fix this. And I'm going to come back to the second half of that story in a second, right? But don't do this, right? Even in physical geography, that is, even if you're not working with people, that is data as well, right? Just because you may not be working with humans doesn't mean you are exempt from respecting data sovereignty. And so, whether you're taking soil samples, you're drilling ice cores out of a glacier, return it. If a community says no to a form of data collection, right, there's a good reason for doing that. I remember getting into an argument with an emeritus professor in my department as a Ph.D. student because he was saying, oh, this Indigenous community down in Peru didn't like that we were drilling into a glacier to collect ice cores. And I was like, well, why is that? Well, they viewed it as a god. And I was like, well, that should have been reason for you to stop, right? But apparently that wasn't good enough for him. I have just a couple more slides left, so I will. Yep, so transparency and funding sources and external relationships, right? So funding makes the world go round in academia. Like, we can't do our work without money, and money is increasingly harder to come by in our neoliberal landscape. And so if you're getting funded by somebody, let the community know. Be open and be forthright about whether you have to share that data with agencies. And especially if you're taking money from the military, if you're taking money from energy companies, because the military and pipeline and oil and gas exploration companies really are quite keen on funding Indigenous research nowadays, let the community know that and be prepared for them to say, well, maybe we don't want to work with you because we don't want our data going to Enbridge, or we don't want our data going to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. All right, so necessary cooking utensils, right? What do we need to do in order to support this work here in the institution? Well, one of the things is institutional forms of research sovereignty support. And so we need to do more mentorship and training on how to do research with Indigenous communities, especially for grad students who are working on time-compressed schedules. We need to respect and support research methodologies that may not fit into traditional, quote, Western or dominant ways of doing research, and we need to have an open dialogue and consultation with Indigenous communities. I remember at Ohio State as a postdoc, I applied to this ethics circles fellowship that they run there, where people get together and talk about ethical questions, and they asked for a project that I wanted to do, and I said, well, I want to write a white paper on how Ohio State can actually do a better job at engaging with tribes when we are going through the institutional research board review process. And they rejected my application because they said, well, there's nobody here, there's no faculty member here who really has expertise in that. And I'm like, I know. I have expertise in it because I went through this process as a PhD student, and then they weirdly never replied to me after that. But we need to support this at the institutional level. Like, it should not be on the back of students and junior faculty and communities to teach institutions on how to ethically engage with us. Full stop. Speaking of junior scholars, right, we can help them by helping them to develop an intentional design of research from the beginning of the program. Like, it is on the advisor to do this as well, right? When my grad students come into my lab, we start from the very beginning and I say, well, what do you want to do? Let's sit down and let's even bring the community that you want to work within, and let's co-design this research together, right? And a lot of times we'll front load that work. We'll say, well, you may not be doing field work for a couple of years, but you're certainly going to talk to folks and we're going to try to map out this work. And really, we need to be able to help junior scholars determine, well, what is feasible and what can be saved for later. A lot of grad students are very ambitious, and they're like, well, I want to do X, Y, and Z. And it's like, well, maybe X is all you can do in an MA thesis. We save Y for your PhD, and Z can be a postdoc or like your work as a faculty member or working in whatever job it is that you want to work in. All right, so timing. Repairing past relationship harms is part of timing, right? And so let me return that back to my department. My university and my department, when that First Nation came to us, like fell over themselves saying, well, we want to fix the harm, right? We're going to do an investigation and we're going into this faculty member's research and we're going to come up and to your community and we're going to have a ceremony and we're going to apologize and we're going to hire a student to do all this work, or do this work on mapping out research protocols on your territory. And I said, slow down. Does the community want you to map out the research protocols in their territory? I bet you that community knows where those research protocols are taking place. And the hereditary chiefs themselves said, yeah, we don't want you rushing up here trying to apologize. We want you to listen to us. And of course, at that point, my department and my dean lost interest, right? And so that community, actually, this was like 8 months ago that they were talking about this, and that community is still asking me to this day, Deondre, like, we want to work with you, but what's going on? Why are they not talking to us? And I'm like, I don't know, because they're not telling me either, right? My university and other places, when they try to repair harm, they are listening to talk, right? They're listening because they want to try to gain things that then come up with their next big solution. We need to listen when we are repairing harm. And I'm going to just be very blunt here and very unacademic here. Like us as researchers and academics, sometimes we need to just shut up and not say anything at all and just listen to the community talk and have there not be a response afterwards, to sit with that discomfort. We need to decenter ourselves into the relationship repair. It is about the community. We need to be transparent with them and talk about this, right? And talk about what we're doing. I mean, the fact that we're not telling the community about an investigation of a researcher who has committed, multiple research violations, that is a problem. Because the community will now think, well, they're not taking us seriously, right? They must think we're stupid, and that, that they're able to just that they're trying to pull the wool over our eyes and not telling us what's going on. And we need to follow the community's lead in the repair process. So like when my chair was like, well, let's get up there. Like we can take a trip this weekend. And I'm like, well, let's let the community tell us what they want. And then, of course, when the community says something, actually do it. And remember that these are ongoing relationships, right? And so just because when you finish the research, right, it doesn't mean your relationships are finished. Don't be what we call a parachute researcher. Don't drop into a community, do work, and then take off again and never talk to them again. The relationships that I've built through my research with Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples, I view those as lifelong relationships and a set of obligations now. When I go back to Minnesota, where I did my dissertation research, I will still visit the people I did research with. I have no further research to do with them, but I'll still talk with them and I'll buy them lunch or breakfast and I will chat with them and I will take an interest in what they're doing. And I will volunteer on their land and help pull weeds or help them sand down a bench that they're going to put in a ceremonial big drum hall, right, that they're constructing. That is part of the research relationship to me, right? It goes much further than just a dissertation or a grant application. If you are lucky enough to form those kinds of relationships with Indigenous communities, you need to honor that. That is a very deep sign of respect and maintain those sorts of relations. I could go on and on about this. I teach a course about this, right? But we have limited time here. And so if you follow this, right, and it's going to be a different path for everybody. This should not be taken as if you follow all of these steps that Deondre told you, you will be able to do Indigenous research anywhere at any time. Nope. It just means that you'll be able to open yourself up to constructing a good relationship with community. And in doing so, you'll be able to maybe come to a very delicious and very positive outcome for you and the communities that are involved. So miigwech, thank you very much. The word for blueberry pie in Ojibwe Moan is mine bashki mine sigani bitusi jigani bakwejigan, which means a blueberry pie. And so there's my contact information right here, my website and my lab's website. Thank you all so very much for your time and your attention.
Thank you so much, Deondre.